So you have Vice President Kamala Harris calling the situation in Gaza catastrophic. It's a really strong word. But during that same period, the U.S. was sending billions of dollars in military aid to Israel. It's a huge contradiction, right? In this explainer, we're going to unpack that. We'll look at her words, her actions, and the massive question that hangs over her legacy. Was she complicit? Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll set the stage with the crisis itself and the official U.S. response. Then, we'll track how Harris's public language changed over time and compare that to what was reportedly going on behind the scenes. All of this builds up to the really tough question of complicity, and we'll wrap up by looking at what this all means for her legacy.
Right, so before we can even get into what Harris said, we've got to understand the context, the numbers, the policy. This is the backdrop for every single decision she was a part of.
And that context starts with the human cost, which is just staggering. According to humanitarian groups, over 67,000 people have been killed in Gaza. It's a number that hangs over every single part of this story.
Now, put that number next to this one. While all of this was happening, the United States sent at least $21.7 billion in military aid to Israel. This is the central tension we're looking at today, that gap between the human toll and the military support.
And look, this wasn't just about money. We're not talking about just writing a check here. According to independent investigators, this constant stream of American weapons and diplomatic cover was essential for Israel's campaign to continue. In other words, U.S. involvement wasn't just there, it was decisive.
Okay, so with that backdrop, where does Vice President Harris fit into all of this? Well, as the crisis got worse and public pressure mounted, you can actually see her public rhetoric begin to shift. Let's go back to December 2023. Early on, her message was really this delicate balancing act. On one hand, she's supporting Israel's right to defend itself. On the other, she's saying very clearly, too many innocent Palestinians have been killed.
Now, fast forward 8 months to August 2024, and you can really hear the shift in her language. She's still affirming Israel's right to self-defense, but her description of what's happening on the ground has become much, much stronger. She's now calling it catastrophic.
And then, of course, came the big one, the most loaded word in this entire conflict: genocide. When she was asked about it directly, her response was, well, it was a masterclass in political caution. She didn't use the term herself, but she didn't shut it down either. Instead, she reframed it as a question that international bodies needed to answer honestly.
But here's where things get really interesting. Her public statements, that's only one side of the coin, because reports started coming out about a real divide between her official public stance and the advice she was giving President Biden in private. So let's break this down. Publicly, the message was pretty much in lockstep with the administration's policy. Israel's right to self-defense was paramount. But behind closed doors, we're told a very different story was unfolding. Sources say she was pushing for more empathy for Gazans, that she was worried about Israel's moral reputation, and that she was urging for the same level of compassion shown to Ukrainians. And, this isn't just gossip or leaks from unnamed sources. Harris actually put this in her own memoir. She confirmed it herself, saying she urged the president to show the same compassion for Gazans as he did for Ukrainians. It's a really rare look behind the curtain of power. So this is the real friction point, right? You've got these private concerns bumping right up against public policy. And that leads us to this incredibly serious charge: complicity. It's a heavy word, so what does it actually mean, legally and morally, in this context?
Let's really break that down for a second.
So in the world of international law, complicity is a big deal. It's not just about what you intended to do. It can be about your actions. If a country supplies weapons and they know those weapons could be used for human rights abuses, that country and its leaders could potentially be held responsible. The question from critics is, did USA cross that line? And that really gets to the heart of the whole debate. On one side, you have the critics saying, look, her private worries and public statements of concern don't really matter when you're still providing the weapons and the diplomatic cover that make it all possible. But on the other side, her defenders argue that she was working inside the system, using the limited power a vice president has to push for a more humane approach. All right, so after all that, where do we land? The truth is, the debate over her role is far from settled, and how history is ultimately going to judge her actions, well, that's still a very open question.
You could probably sum up her position like this. She didn't write the policy from scratch, but as vice president, she was definitely not just a passive bystander. She was a key figure in the administration that made it happen. And that really is the criticism that's going to stick, isn't it? The idea that for all the evolving language and the private concerns, the core policy never really changed. The aid, the weapons, they just kept flowing. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Was her role just a symbol of continuity, just business as usual for American foreign policy? Or was this a huge critical moment in history that demanded a completely different kind of leadership, a moment that was ultimately missed? That's the question that history is going to have to answer.